Have you ever watched a movie that you wished would never end? No. Has anyone perhaps had that experience? Yeah, I'm sure you have. Or perhaps it was a novel, a book that you read that you wished would never end. You wanted the story to continue on. Or how about a vacation that you wish would never end? Yeah. How about this one? How about a homily you wish would never end? That'd be a miracle. Have you ever noticed that when you're in the midst of enjoying something deeply, that we kind of dwell in a kind of a blissful ignorance of the passing of time, and we unconsciously we know that time is passing, but we kind of are in this blissful ignorance, and then eventually we have to shift into a kind of a grudging curiosity about just how much time has actually passed, and we take a look at our watches, or we look at the calendar to remind ourselves of what day it actually is, how much time we have left. And then we eventually come to this cool acceptance of the fact that this most enjoyable activity or experience, whatever it is about to end. And it's about the end that Jesus speaks about in the gospel today. We hear these words, Jesus spoke to his disciples about, let's try that again. Jesus spoke to his disciples about, which is to come. And I would like to speak to you, disciples, today about the end. Now you might say, well, that's not a very cheery topic. Well, blame the readings. I get stuck with these readings. And every year as we get towards the end of the liturgical year, because next week is the Feast of Christ the King, the final weekend of the year, and then it's our new year, the week after, we begin the season of Advent to prepare for Christmas. So at the end of this year, we begin to speak about the end. We have these kind of strange gospel readings that are kind of like a number of different sayings of Jesus that the gospel writers have put together for us. And so in this particular reading, I'd like to quickly summarize what Jesus tells us. He tells us three things. Number one, the world will end. The world is finite. And we believe in faith that creation will cease to exist as it presently does and will be renewed. There'll be a new creation. And science tells us this, that our star, from which we get our energy, is burning out. That it's finite. The sun will burn out. It will cease to exist. Now, don't panic. We've got 5 billion more years before that happens. But it's finite. It will end. The second point is that Jesus will return as judge. See, Jesus came the first time as merciful Savior, an embodiment of God who is merciful, who is all-loving. But when Jesus returns, and we believe that he will, he returns as judge. He returns as the embodiment of the justice of God, because God is perfectly just as well as perfectly loving. And we say that in the Creed, he will come again to judge the living and the dead. So Jesus will return as judge. And the third point is that no one knows the hour. Jesus says this in several places, and in other Gospels he even says, if anyone claims that they do know the hour, don't listen to them. And throughout church history, there's been no shortage of people who have claimed to know the hour, or claimed that their present time was the time. Some people have even proposed dates. We boil all this down, and what do we come to? We come to this point: live your life as if it was the last day of your life. I mean, think about it. If today was the last day of your life, what would you do this afternoon? I'd suspect that most of us would not watch the football game today. Focus on that which is most important. Focus on the things that will last rather than the things that are passing away. And if we do this, all shall be well. For this is best aligned with our deepest desires as human beings, because we are finite beings longing for the infinite. But when we forget that we are finite, made for the infinite, we begin to think that we are infinite, made for the finite. And finite things leave us empty and unfulfilled. Finite things will never satisfy human longing. And when we focus on finite things, we all too easily forget that we are finite, that we are mortal, that there is an end which is to come. You see, the end isn't just for creation. There is a particular end to our own lives that is to come. I'm sure you're aware of this, but just in case, there was a scientific study done a number of years ago, and what they found was quite shocking, that among human beings, they found a 100% mortality rate. It's very shocking. So there is an end that is to come. And just as there will be a general judgment, when our end comes, there will be a particular judgment. That's what we believe. There will be a particular judgment. And finally, we do not know the day or the hour. We don't know the day or the hour, so we have to be alert, be awake, which is difficult in our present culture because, as someone once said, we live in a death-defying and a death-denying culture. No generation, no culture has ever had the gifts of research, of medical technology to be so defiant of death. I mean, thanks be to God. I mean, what medical science is able to do is incredible. It's not a perfect science, but compared to past generations, like we defy death. We live longer, we live healthier. We have access to medical care, even though it's not perfect. We're incredibly blessed. But that defiance of death can lead us sometimes into a culture of denial of death. And there's something in the human condition that can even deny imminent death. When death is in the room with us, we can still sometimes be in deep denial. You know, the other day I was looking at a photograph of my dad. And my dad passed away 5 years. I really do miss him. But I was looking at this picture and I realized, oh my goodness, in that picture, he's the same age as I am now. And I thought he was an old guy. I was at that time, he was an old guy. But as I'm standing there looking at the picture, the same age as him, guess what? I'm a young guy. Yeah, denial, right? Denial. You know, reflecting on this reality reminded me of something I read in a novel when I was in my 20s. I went through a kind of a Russian literature phase, and I read a number of novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky, a very famous novelist. And in this particular novel that I read, I remembered this dialogue, and I went up and I looked it up yesterday and found the page. And the main character at the beginning of the book spends a lot of time interacting with other characters, speaking to them about an experience he had that rocked his world. And what it was is that he witnessed the public execution of a condemned man. And the whole dialogue in the book is a reflection on how we deal with the reality of death and the passing of time. And in the story, he talked about how the man, in his last week, he had a whole week. Well, that's a long time. Got a whole week to live. And then day after day, finally he came to the final day, and it was like, I have a whole day to live. Then he had his last 5 hours. He had his breakfast, and I've still got 5 hours. It's a long time. And then they came to get him, and they put him on the wagon, and they began to take the wagon through the streets. And this is a quote from the character in the book. He says this, I think that he too must have thought he had an endless time to live while he was being driven through the town. He must have thought on the way, there's a long time left. 3 streets more. I shall pass through this one, and then through the next, and then there's the one on the left, and then there's a baker's on the right. It'll be a long time before we get to the baker's. It will be a long time before we get to the baker's. He even talks about, as he's walking up the steps, he's like, well, I've still got 2 more steps and 1 more step, and I still have 2. It's like, this denial, this all too human and all too familiar denial. What can we do to live in greater awareness of our finite nature and the infinite God who created us for himself? You see, in the Middle Ages, there was a common spirituality that often included what was called memento mori. And this is Latin. It means, remember you will die. Just remember it. And people used to it was often the symbol of the skull or skull and crossbones, and they'd sometimes have a skull on their desk or on a piece of art or around the house, like an image, a reminder that death was a part of life. Now today, I mean, let's be honest, if we did that, the neighbors might think us a little weird, right? Or say, that's kind of creepy. It reminds me of the famous Capuchin crypt in Rome. Now, if you've ever been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Has anyone been there? A few people. So, I'm going to tell you about this. At the bottom of the Via Veneto, there's a church. And in the basement of the church, it's run by the Franciscans. If you ever go to Rome, you have to go see this. Because about 200 years ago, one of the monks, I guess he got bored one day, and he went down to the crypt where all the bones and skeletons of monks for like hundreds of years. And he took, and this is a true story, he took the bones and made artistic displays with the bones, piling up the skulls and the bones and the collarbones, and he even made a chandelier out of the bones. And you can go in this basement, and there are 8 rooms. Now, it sounds horrible, doesn't it? Doesn't it sound gross? Well, look, I've got a photograph to show you. If you don't want to see it, close your eyes. But here's one of the photographs. Yeah, those are actual skeletons of monks, and those are skulls and the bones. And there's entire rooms decorated with ribs, and it's like, this is totally weird. This is bizarre. Talk about a memento mori. And also there's a certain kind of playfulness or even mockery of death that reflects what St. Paul said in 2 Corinthians. He said, oh, death, where is your sting? Where is your victory? He says that death has been defeated by the death of Jesus on the cross and his resurrection. And so a proper Christian attitude to death is a kind of mocking it because it's lost its ultimate power. Now, that's not to say that we as believers deny the reality of grief. Grief is real, and grief and faith coexist. Faith does not destroy grief, and grief does not overcome faith. It should not overcome faith. So I want to acknowledge that for many people, this might be a challenging message. As you exit this basement, there is a sign as you go out. And if you had your eyes closed, you can open your eyes now. And the sign says this: what you are now, we used to be. What we are now, you will be. What we are now, what you are now, we used to be. These were real people. Those monks used to stand and give homilies in churches. They had relationships. They grew up. They had mothers and fathers, and they lived life. What we are now, you will be. Now that's a memento mori. That is a reminder that we are finite and that we are made for the infinite. Now, what do we do with all this? Now, since, as far as I know, there are no church basements in Dartmouth full of bones, you might be glad to hear that. But I'd like to suggest 3 things that we can do. The first one is to attend the Memorial Mass next Monday, on November 25th. We have a special Mass to remember those who passed away in the past year. But it's not limited to that, and we all have loved ones that we've lost. And it's a good time to come and again reflect on our own mortality in the context of faith. A second thing is to go and visit a cemetery. Go and pray in a cemetery. You know, up until very recently, that was a very common thing that people did. People went to cemeteries a lot. Today, again, because of this denial of death, it's something that we often don't do. Even more and more in our culture, we don't even bury people anymore. So go and visit a cemetery, walk around, reflect and pray and meditate. Or thirdly, simply ask the Lord for a healthy awareness of our own mortality. To have a kind of memento mori. You see, this is not weird. It's actually very healthy. It is. It's actually very healthy. It's not morbid. It's actually very healthy. And if at first you do find it a bit creepy, you'll get over it. Because we are finite, and there is an end that is to come, an end that will come. But it's an end that is the beginning of something so much better than any movie or any book or any vacation. And it will never end. Unlike this homily, which has now ended. Amen.